All right. Thanks for joining us, Nina Lakhani. You're the author of a really amazing book that I just finished, Who Killed Berta Cáceres, and published through Verso, coming out this month in June. So, could you just start by introducing yourself and how this story came to you or how you came to this story?
Sure. So I'm Nina Lakhani. I'm a British journalist. You might tell by my accent. And I, for the before moving to the US 6 months ago, I was based in Mexico City, and I was a freelance journalist covering Mexico and Central America. So I met Berta when I went to Honduras for the first time, which was at the end of 2013. And my main reason was for going was that there were going to be elections, and these were like the first so-called free and fair elections after a coup which had taken place in 2009. But I stayed for a couple of weeks to report some different stories, and that's when I met Berta and interviewed her. The only time that I interviewed her. And she was on the lam. She was on the run, trying to avoid being arrested on a trumped up charge that had been bought by a dam company called DESA. And this dam company had been given a license to build a hydroelectric dam on a river called the Gualcarque River, on Lenca territory. So Berta is indigenous Lenca, and the Gualcarque River is considered sacred by the Lenca people, and that dam was sanctioned. Also, that it was licensed without consulting the local communities as required by law. And so she, at the request of the community, had been spearheading a campaign to stop construction of this dam. And as a result, the company, um, with the help of um, the state, and by that I mean prosecutors, judges, police, the military, who had all come in on top of her and the community and her organization called Copin. Um, um, they'd been terrorizing them, and part of that campaign had been to try and jail her and a couple of other leaders of the organization. And so the three of them were facing charges, but she was the only one that the judge had ordered to be imprisoned on remand. And so when I met her, she was on the run. And so I went to interview her at her family home in a town called La Esperanza, which is at the heart of Lenca territory in western Honduras, sort of towards El Salvador, that border. And yeah, and we spoke for an hour, and that was the only interview I ever did with her. And I I left Honduras, went back to Mexico, and kept following what was happening with her. And but I never met her again. And then 2.5 years after that meeting, so in March 2016, I wake up one morning to a bunch of mixed messages from my editor at The Guardian telling me that she'd been murdered. And that's when I started, my initial thought was, I was on holiday at the time with friends, and I just remember thinking, God, if I can murder Bertha, they can murder anybody, because at that point she was probably the most famous or well-known defender, activist in the Americas, and they killed her anyway. And so, yeah, I guess I just started really quickly reporting on her death, and that's how things started.
Yeah, Bertha is a very well known land defender, as you say, indigenous land defender. And it's important to recognize kind of her legacy and what she really represents in terms of, the fact that like indigenous people who are defending forests, defending waterways, defending mountains from strip mining are often targeted for violence, and especially in places like Latin America, as you detail, this kind of long, drawn out, dirty war that really, begins with colonization and the invasion of Europeans, and in particular the Spanish. and then continues on through this kind of long history of conquest that you detail and exploitation. I was wondering if you could maybe just give us a brief history of this particular place, Honduras, and what led up to, I mean, I'm going to ask you to do 2 centuries or several centuries of
Good.
history in a single question, because that's where you begin. I mean, you begin with Berta Cáceres' assassination, but then the next chapter, you move into this really, I think, compelling historical backdrop to really contextualize where the struggle emerges and who is, Berta Cáceres and the history that really defines her and shapes her.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I started reporting and investigating her murder, that's what, as a reporter, that's what I was doing, trying to sort of unpick what had happened, But then when I decided to do the book, I quickly realized that you to understand why Bertha was murdered, you have to understand who she was, and you have to understand where she came from, And so that's, I guess, that was the reason behind sort of really telling the story of her and her background, and some of that history, as you say. So Honduras was, when the Spanish colonized Central America, it was Honduras that they came into. Was I think it was first, or at least one of the first countries that they entered by force. And at the time, the Lenca people were the biggest native um, group in terms of territory and in terms of numbers. And Lempira, he was one of the leaders of the, I guess we'd call him a clan leader now, who sort of united this, different groups to really to put up a defense against the Spanish, but ultimately, was completely overpowered by, this massive monster, which was Spain, and the Spanish, all the powers that they had, and all the weapons that they had, that they used across the continent. And so, and just really sort of briefly, I guess, I mean, when Bertha was growing up, so she was born in 1971. I mean, her family, her mom, who is her, her biggest influence. I mean, she didn't see very much of her biological father. Her mom was identified as a Catholic. I mean, she's a staunch Catholic, really, and she didn't really grow up with an Indigenous identity, but it was something, she also, as a young child, would, with her mom, who was a nurse and a midwife, they would walk for miles to these rural, abandoned sort of cantons, communities, where clearly they were indigenous communities who had just, were surviving in the most terrible conditions, no water, no light, no roads, no, very little access to any sort of types of basic services. And I think those early experiences were really, really marked her. And I think as a young woman, as an adolescent, and certainly with Salvador Zuniga, who would become her husband, who again, he was brought up as a Protestant. His family didn't identify as Indigenous, but the two of them, it became part of this discovery, and what really had happened was that Indigenous groups and identity, and specifically among Nalenka people, had purposefully been, wiped out or attempted to be wiped out. The language had been lost. And there was so, and we've seen happen, all over the world, traditions and spiritual parts, spiritual customs, and so forth, were still being practiced, but they were being practiced really in clandestine ways because of fear of being stigmatized and punished. And, really just generations of people being Indian, being native, being being used as a way to, to put somebody down. It was as clear as that. And I think that, but as she got older, and as a teenager, her and Salvador, they went to um, they joined the El Salvadoran guerrillas in the civil war that was happening in their native, in a neighboring country. And and I just think through the people they talked to and the people they met in El Salvador, they would say they would hear that there were no indigenous people left, that they'd been wiped out in massacres, and yet they would meet people, poor people who would talk about a connection to the land, who would had these connections to Mother Nature, to water, to land, and and also they were piecing all of these pieces of the jigsaw together, I guess. And then when they come back to Honduras in the early 90s, they create this organization, the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. And and they're still figuring out what they want to do. They know they want to do something around indigenous rights, and they're starting to, understand that when you talk about indigenous rights, that you're talking about land rights. When you talk about indigenous rights, you're talking about all human rights. You're talking about the defense of natural resources, and so they were already starting to formulate that when on the 1st of January 1994, we have the Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico, and that was a real light bulb moment for her, that this is what we need to do. We are going to frame our movement, which will be a peaceful movement, an unarmed movement, unlike the Zapatistas, but we are going to frame our movement, our struggle for human rights as indigenous rights, and that was really, that's how it sort of really cemented in their minds, that actually, and to do that, if you were going to, they were already thinking about, okay, what is it that our communities don't have? No schools, no roads, no health services, none of those things. But really, without land, it's, indigenous identity and dignity and rights are so linked to land and natural resources. They had to be central, to any struggle. And so right from the beginning, they set out protesting and opposing and stopping illegal loggers, trying to destroy indigenous territory. They won, through peaceful means again, um, land titles for more than 200 communities. But I mean, I lay this out in the book because I think it's so significant in terms of who Bertha was and how she will be remembered. They had this amazing idea to do to to have pilgrim marches. So this is 1994, and I mean, at that point, the
And they also allied with the Garifuna movement as well.
they did, and I mean, I don't think that was planned, though. I mean, I think they set out from Western Honduras, from the mountains. The Lenca people are hill people, and like that part of Honduras is like the most. It's like the highest part, It's sort of
Hmm.
chilly, The Garifunas come from the coast, and the Lencas
Right.
are from the mountains, right? But they didn't. I don't think that was planned. And but the idea of Bertha and Salvador and Copin was to walk to Tegucigalpa, the capital, which is about 200 miles south, to just to demand their rights, and to show Honduras, show the mestizo, like the non-indigenous or mixed race majority by that point, that they existed, that they weren't relics of the past, that they were still there, and they were there to, and they were gonna demand and fight for their rights. So they set off, from the mountains, and then Honduras doesn't have a great road system, so there's one big road that comes from the north, the coast, down San Pedro, from San Pedro Sula, which is the second biggest city, and on that road towards Tegucigalpa, all of the other indigenous communities of Honduras, the Maya Shorty, the Miskito, the Tulapan, the Tawaka, and Pech people, they all joined, and the Garifuna, the Garifuna, the Afro-Hondurans, who descend from West and Central African and Caribbean people, they all joined, and they all marched together. And I've seen pictures, but how I wish I could have lived that moment. It was, that's where Bertha meets Miriam Miranda, the leader of
Right.
one of the leaders of the Garifuna people.
And they become really good friends too, right?
Yeah, I mean, they become closer than sisters. They were like, you know, professionally, personally, and their organizations, they become tight, both. And, these two incredibly smart, capable, determined women, who leaders, just, these phenomenal leaders, and they grow together, and Miriam's about 10 years older than Bertha. So I was a bit, longer in the tooth by then. In 1994, Bertha's still only 23. She's still only 23. By then, she's got 4 children, and so Miriam, I think, was a huge, like a huge role model for her as well. But the two of them, yeah, I mean, on that march, they were together. Miriam tells these brilliant stories of Bertha, stopping at the Palmerola airport, which is the airport which was then and still used by the US military as its headquarters in Central America, painting graffiti on the walls with paint, yeah, and just that's where they meet. And really, that was a massive turning point. And I think that many people would argue is how Bertha should and will be best remembered in 10, 20, 30 years, as a person who led the way in the recuperation, the recovery of Lenca identity, because from that stem many things, politically, that it led to many developments, including land titles, including a prosecutor's office, specifically for Indigenous crimes against Indigenous groups. Many things, but really, I think that sort of and really, it led the way for the Lenca people regaining, recovering, retaking their pride and identity, and in terms of their traditions, in terms of spiritual practices, into, all of those things which they had for so long had been, you know I mean, the oppression, of the colonizers, and, to take that away, or try to take those things away, that, the lid was lifted, and really that recovery of the Lenca identity, I think, really is one of the ways that she will be remembered forever.
It really reminded me a lot of Ben Dingle's book, The 500-Year Rebellion. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but he talks about the kind of recuperation of an indigenous identity through Tupac Katari, or what he calls Catarismo, in Bolivia. And Tupac Katari was like an Amira indigenous leader who kind of united indigenous and African people in kind of a common resistance against the Spanish at that particular time. And somebody like Lempira, the Lenca leader that you had mentioned, after he was killed in 1537, you kind of mentioned that there was this prophecy of a woman reuniting indigenous people. And so in some ways, I'm not saying that, Berta was this this like messianic person, but in some ways she kind of was very prophetic in exactly the things that you just spelled out, and kind of reinvigorating an indigenous identity and an indigenous pride. Because I think a lot of times, the politics of indigenousness north of the U.S. Mexico border are talked about in a way that doesn't really relate or understand how indigenous identity works in places like Latin America, where there is the same kind of erasure, but it's a different kind of erasure, where you have people who phenotypically look indigenous, but deny that they are indigenous. And you mentioned a little bit about the kind of the mestizo or the mestizaje process of erasure, and at this particular moment in time, when Berta was organizing, it wasn't a popular thing to be indigenous, and Indio was a bad word, right? It was kind of a way to racialize, but also to associate people with a certain class position. So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about um, the the kind of general, what you call the generalized violence as state policy. And you write, and towards the end of the book, today the mystery or uncertainty created by generalized violence is the state policy. The nightmare that has unfolded in Honduras since the 2009 coup has shown that repressive state structures endured after the Dirty War. The elites behind them regrouped, modernized, and reactivated their forces to prop up the emerging criminal state. As hundreds of thousands the country's economy is increasingly propped up by remittances. The language has changed, but for those clinging to power and making the money, the end always justifies the means. And I was wondering if you could explain that particular phrase, because I feel like it really sums up some of the major points that you're making in this book.
The end justifies the means.
The entire the continuation of the dirty wars
Okay, yeah.
and the coup.
I mean, I was writing there specifically about Honduras, but I could have been talking about Mexico. I could have been talking
Right.
about Guatemala, El Salvador, any of these countries. And really, and I mean, I think it also sort of relates to your previous point that actually, what happened during the 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 fight against communism, and I say that with with inverted commas, the Cold War and the proxy Cold War that was fought, in Central America. I mean, one of the first things to note is being an Indio, being an indigenous person, basically became equated to being a communist. And why did that happen? Because what you had in countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, but that was sort of slightly different, Nicaragua, really social uprisings of the poorest people, which in many cases were rural and indigenous people, really in a search of just some better conditions. I mean, just the inequalities and was so stark, and it was about land distribution. A lot of it, it was about land, but also just access to any spaces, whether it be political or education and all of these things. And so, to fit in with the rhetoric that suited, the US and Russia at the time, um, these sort of these demands and these struggles for social progress, for it wasn't, I mean, I can't even think people were going for equality then. I mean, they were looking for some very small modest sort of improvements in what were dire sort of living circumstances and conditions. Were very what's the word, I mean, they were just then interpreted, or there was they were then called communists, and so that's the context of it, right? And so then you had the whole force and power of the US military machine, and in what the counterinsurgency war, really. And then we have to, I think, name John F. Kennedy and really sort of the sort of, I guess, a start point of counterinsurgency and special forces, which I talk a lot about in this book. And really, that's where the end justifies the mean. You had special forces that were special. They were considered special because they were allowed to play, they were allowed to go, there were no rules for the special forces. The end justified the mean. But they really, what they started out for was completely and utterly sort of, railroaded when it came to the fight against communism, and nowhere more so than Central America. And so you had just the training by the US of these death squads, just like killing machines all over the region. And how did they do that? They had political and military sort of and business powerhouses in these countries who they partnered up with, who also had no interest in anything changing. They wanted to keep the status quo as well, and they all teamed up to fight these proxy wars where indigenous and rural poor people were labeled communists. That's what happened, right? And hundreds of thousands of people were killed just in between. If you just look at El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, And Honduras, you're talking about what, probably 350, 400,000 civilians were, mainly civilians were killed. Many were indigenous. Yeah, and then you had the peace accords, the Berlin Wall falls, and then you have, a domino effect of peace accords that are signed across the region. So what happens? Do these power machines just go away? Are they dismantled? No. I mean, I think all the evidence now shows from countries like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, that actually, even during the Civil War, these military elites were already engaged in sort of criminal activity in terms of things like contraband, in terms of, arms, drugs, other, illegal activities on top of the sort of killing of innocent people. And so really that they just redirect their interests and their energies into these into developing these criminal enterprises. Now, that's not to say they all become, flag carrying bad guys, right? So a lot of these folks remain in the military, start up private security firms, become politicians, become owners of big companies, invest in extractive industries, mines, energy companies, cash crops, all of these things. These are the same group of people who were controlling these countries. Honduras, we're talking about specifically here, but generally, that continue to control everything when the dirty war is supposedly over, and that's why I say that actually when you look at somewhere like, I mean, Honduras didn't have an official civil war, but when you look at places like Guatemala, where I spent a lot of time working, some of the worst massacres that happened, you look at the conditions those poor indigenous people are living today, and nothing's really changed in 50 years. Nothing really changed. Those sort of same struggles continued, right? But you have, but what you have is really just a redirecting of state resources and aid or money from, friendly governments like the US and others, to to invest in the military, to invest in security forces, to really sort of cement these, militarized states. And then the extractive industries just proliferate. I mean, I'll give you one example. In Guatemala, the first law to be written after the peace accords are signed in 1996 is a mining law, and it was written in English. Um, it's, and this is repeated all over. You can see the same things happening all over the place. The Colombia, most recently, why did the peace accords get signed in Colombia? Finally, the sort of the eyes of these big companies to get the natural resources out of the ground absolutely played a role, and so that's what happened. And so what you've seen happen in Honduras, and Bertha's murder happens in this context, is that the same network of elites, and when I say elites, I'm talking about the people who run the show, right? Politicians, military, religious elites. But at top of that hierarchy are the economic elites, the people the money makers, the power brokers, who are controlling the politicians. They're controlling them. The politicians are really the second level of power, and so these same networks, everyone gets rich, but the economic elites get most rich, right? They're the ones that are controlling everything. And because they control all aspects of the state, then actually when you have an insurgency, when there is, or when you have an indigenous group who is opposing and, opposing the imposition of a big environmentally destructive mega project on their land, they have access to all of that state apparatus, so this company, DESA, it has, as its majority shareholds, members of one of the most powerful clans in Honduras, and that clan as a whole is involved in all sorts of big businesses, banking, media, all sorts of different things. You have them. You have, as the president of the company, a US trained former intelligence officer. You have, as the initial security chief, a US trained military officer, and so really they're very well placed to be able to, when Bertha and her group and the community start opposing peacefully opposing construction of a dam by setting up a roadblock, the military is called in. I mean, so fast, the whole of this rural area is militarized, and they don't even try to hide the complicity. I mean, the company's dam installation is where the military have their barracks. I mean, they've set up temporary barracks in that installation. It's like it's just they're so well placed, and they're so well placed to do that. The influence is at every level: political, through security forces, through the police. And so really they are able to use all of this sort of spectrum of tools that were similarly employed during the Dirty War. It's the same sort of spectrum. So discrediting, threats, harassment, attempts to bribing, dividing communities through bribes and in other ways. And then these escalate, criminalizing, throwing people in jail. And really, and I make the point in the book as really, this is like for me, the central point, that Bertha's murder was the grand finale. It was part of this campaign of, mechanisms or strategies used, which were very much what you would have seen during the counterinsurgency operations to try and silence her. And when they couldn't, that's what they murdered her, because they were not able to get rid of her and to stop her using any other means.
And it seems like the coup itself, raises a lot of questions in 2009 because, somebody like Zelaya, the president at the time, he kind of reminded me a lot of somebody like Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. He definitely wasn't a communist, right? Perhaps he had some liberal kind of left leaning policies, and I think Arbenz was his biggest crime was land reform, right? And it wasn't even like a comprehensive like revolutionary land reform, but it became the justification for U.S. intervention and the eventual like overthrow or the coup in Guatemala. But in Honduras in 2009, you know, Zelaya had, I think, 6 months left in his term. He was overthrown by this kind of core group of military folks. Even some of them even some of the military commanders were reluctant to even participate in it. And I think it was Obama right afterwards called it a coup. And then quickly thereafter, Clinton corrected and say, no, this is not a coup. And it seems like this set in motion the kind of the state repression to come down on somebody like Berta Cáceres, but also these movements and these resistances against these resistance movements against these mega projects, but also not just the kind of like dam projects, but things that were billed as clean or sustainable energy projects. And that was something that really kind of stuck out to me, because it's not the quote unquote traditional kind of resource extractive relationship, but in fact is like often billed in the North and the global North as something that is a good thing. And now we don't have to engage in violent conflict or engage in like harmful kind of energy production anymore, because we have things such as palm oil that could be potentially an alternative to like the fossil industry. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about a little bit about that, like the coup. Berta herself, I think, was running for vice president at the time, or had planned to run for vice president, and how it really set back those movements, but then began this kind of increased state repression.
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, Manuel Zelaya had 6 months left of his presidency, and by no one's definition was he a lefty. I mean, he came from a traditional landowning family. He'd once, been a sort of representative on the Loggers Association. But it is right that during his presidency, he did become more progressive. I mean, I think he was his sort of close circle of advisors were more progressive, and he did. He knew Berta's mom, Doña Berta, Doña Astra, I should say, Astra Berta, who was a political. She'd been a politician in her day, and he'd worked with her in the past, and so he knew the family and so forth. But he started listening. He did start listening to communities, especially indigenous communities, but all sorts of rural, farming movements, etc. And at the same time, I mean, he you know any concession. I mean, the thing about the elites, and you can see that happening today in the US, right? That the economic elites, which in this country, like the people behind the all the dirty energy, the fossil fuels, um, they're not willing to give up a single cent. Do you know what I mean? It's not like suddenly their money, they're going to be poor people, but they're not willing to give up a single bit of control or profits. And that was what happened in Honduras, right? And so what he was proposing were quite modest reforms, in terms of land reform, in terms of political reform, in terms of minimum wage. What, whether this is a mistake or not, but in terms of realpolitik, it wasn't. It's certainly what Clinton used to justify her enabling of the coup to stick. Was that he did business with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Now, that relationship has been completely and utterly overplayed by Clinton, by the elites in Honduras, and by many people, right? They didn't have that much in common. I mean, Chavez was like a military man, I don't think he took Zelaya particularly seriously. But when Zelaya, just as one example, tried to renegotiate this completely scandalous oil tariff, that was being imposed only on Honduras when they were importing oil. No, it was just a big fat no, right? There was like no movement on it at all. And so he went to Chavez and did a deal with Chavez's Petrocaribe oil, program. And that obviously upset everyone. It upset George W. Bush. It upset the US ambassador to Honduras. It upset the elites who were making money out of the oil industry, etc. And so really there was just like a gradual sort of deterioration in this, and when Zelaya was more and more isolated.
So he basically did like what a normal country would do and try to get the best deal for his own country.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the
That was
time,
his crime.
yeah, and I mean, he was trying to implement energy reform. I mean, Honduras, honestly, it has some of the most expensive um, petrol, what do you call it, gas, right? Gas, and energy anywhere in the whole of the Americas. And he was trying to actually, did he do everything right? Absolutely not. But the fact is, he was illegally deposed from his post. He was shipped, he was helicoptered or flown out of the country in his pajamas, right? And he was flown out, and that coup, which, as you rightly said, Obama called a coup, and then Hillary backtracked. Um, quickly, really, just a talk became straight away about just, well, let's have new elections. It's like, hang on a minute, we don't need new elections. We have a president. Just bring him back, let him come back, and to finish his term. There were elections due for November of that year, and yet Berta was going to be on the vice president ticket with an independent candidate. And it had been a real time of hope, of really just of what she and many people were looking for was a rewriting of the constitution, in which there would be a rethinking of the social contract between government and society and people, a more equal, more just relationship, where all groups were identified and recognized and properly sort of represented. And that's what the elites did not want. They had no interest in changing anything. They liked it just the way it was, and so yeah, the coup happens and it unleashes what the coup plotters did not expect was the social uprising that followed. But people, tens of thousands of people took to the streets every single day for 6 months. What they knew was that they had to stop there being new elections in November of 2009. They had to get Zelaya back, and they were on the streets every day, and they were repressed, they were tear gassed, they were, riot police, they were beaten. We still don't know exactly how many people were killed and disappeared. And it just unleashed this sort of, catastrophic wave of violence that never stopped. Because what happens in 2009 in November is that elections are held with the full support of the US government. All international election observers boycott that election. Half the population boycotts that election. All the opposition candidates do too. But the Republican Party from the US sends in an observation team, right? And so that you have Pepe Lobo winning from the right-wing National Party, winning this so-called election, which only half the population voted in. Went to the ballot box, and who does he thank in his acceptance speech? Hillary Clinton. And really, what happens then, and it started in the 6 months where there was a de facto government. The big plan is to sell off the natural resources of the country. Honduras has so many natural resources in terms of fertile land, in terms of rivers and lakes, and minerals. It is a resource-rich country, and there's just a big sell-off. And so a whole series of laws are passed in the most undemocratic ways. Laws are passed at the dead of night when no one is there. Contracts are signed, licenses are granted without any debate. Many laws as passed just days before new president is sworn in. That happens again and again and continues to happen today. And first of all, they sold off the rivers, and land for mining, as well as sort of land for cash crops like for biofuels. So African palms, like you say, sugarcane, maize, but specifically with the intention of selling them for biofuels and on the carbon credit market. And these projects are all imposed. They are imposed on rural and indigenous territory, and the indigenous people are the government is legally obliged, both through national law and international law, to consult communities before imposing any project on their territories, right? And that doesn't happen, not once. That has not happened on one single occasion in any project in Honduras, never. And so what you have then is that and at the same time, violence is just, out of control, right? So the coup happens in 2009. By 2010 or 2011, we know that around 80% of all cocaine destined for the US market from South America, so from Colombia, from Venezuela, is transiting through Honduras. Right? And by 2014, it is the most dangerous place in the world outside a war zone. And it holds that inglorious record for several years. And it continues to be one of the most dangerous countries in the world, despite recent government figures claiming that violence is, down, because people are still fleeing. And so it becomes, the violence is generalized and targeted. So what you see in those post-coup years is that Honduras becomes the most dangerous country in the world to defend land and to defend the environment. The most dangerous country in the world for lawyers, for journalists, for LGBTQ community. It's both, right? But when you have a situation when you've got dozens of murders every day, when a land defender gets killed, it's very, conveniently the government could say, oh, well, it was just it was the gangs, they caught up in the gang confrontation, or it was just it's a perfect smokescreen. It's like you don't there is never a reason for the state to acknowledge targeted killings, because they have this they have the smoke screen of, well, there's everyone's getting killed. There's violence everywhere. Why do you think it's because of their activism, or why do you think it's because of their sexual orientation? I mean, it just wasn't. It's never been recognized. But that's the context in which people start getting killed and leaders start getting killed. Political opposition, social leaders, like I said, indigenous rights leaders, campesinos, so peasant farmers are targeted in the most violent way in the north of the country, and that is really linked to the battle, a battle against palm industrialists who had taken their land and have just turned this fertile area that was known as the bread, the sort of the breadbasket of Central America, because it produced so many grains and fruits and so forth, into just a monocultural, of African palms, and that oil is extracted and used for, processed food or for biofuels.
Hmm. The title of your book is "Who Killed Berta Cáceres?" And in some ways, if we use Berta's analysis of what she calls later on in the book patriarchal capitalism, it could also be what killed Berta Cáceres, because she identified this kind of capitalist system as one in which it destroys the earth, or what she called Mother Earth, and specifically indigenous people. But there's a gendered component, right? The domination of nature is directly related to the domination of women, or non-men in this particular case. And so in some ways, reading some of these passages, you didn't translate some of them, but my limited Spanish um, understands them as being very kind of derogatory, sexist comments, in the way that, looking at these like WhatsApp groups, or looking at some of the testimony, or even your own interviews, of the way of the things that she was called, it was very sexualized, and very sexist in nature. And so I was wondering if you could talk about this kind of idea of a patriarchal capitalist system, and here in the Americas we understand it as femicide in Latin America, but in North America we have the term murdered missing indigenous women, which is directly related to the same kind of extractive industries that are developing within Latin America. But this is also connected to the actual men who carried out the plot against Berta Cáceres's life. But then on top of that, what you kind of reveal in the investigation, but then also in the court case itself as it transpires, there's a larger looming question of who carried out, who issued the orders, and all of this, and who turned a blind eye, or who was an accomplice at higher levels to this particular assassination.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right when when we trolled through the sort of phone data, and we had access to some of the phone data through for the phones that belonged to some of the killers who were later prosecuted, but also members of the company, the company. You saw this very casual, use of really racist and misogynist terms to address Bertha and the people, her community. So Indio, Pinche Indio, which well, I won't say because it's really rude, but but just and yeah, and just sort of these over like sexualized, sexually harassing sort of terms. And I think that's a really stark sort of mirror, really, or to see that that's how she over the years learned, and understood that neoliberalism, capitalism is it is sort of patriarchal, right? And so it's sort of that it, it's sort of the way that it's sort of, I mean, it's influenced by patriarchy, or it's part of patriarchy, but it also affects women in different ways, right? And it's sort of, I mean, on every level. And I think what she really was sort of her evolving sort of discourse was very much as that. She saw, she didn't see patriarchy or capitalism as being equal in terms of how it impacted men and women or indigenous and non-indigenous people. And I think that's sort of part of that, how, the way that she understood these, the dominant economic and political sort of power, or doctrine in which we have all been sort of forced to exist in, for many years. And I think, in the trial, not once does the state, so the prosecution, make any reference to her being indigenous, her being a woman. Why is that important? She wasn't just. She was killed because of who she was and what she represented and how she represented, and the the sort of ability that she had to organize and to lead. She was killed because of who she was, and yet, and also I think that when you look at sort of the language that was used, and also the context in terms of the misogyny and the machismo, as I call it, in Spanish, of the society and how that world operates, is that the idea to these people that a woman and a native woman could be interrupting their plans, that could be costing them money, was just intolerable. It was, that was not, they were not going to let that happen. She was a bad example, that, and they were not going to be outsmarted or outdone by this pinche India, right? This indigenous woman, and I think that, it was, if really the prosecution, if the investigation and the prosecution and state had really wanted to get to the bottom of why Bertha was killed and who was involved, and really to, to follow the evidence where it took them, you would have to be looking at both of those things, of her as an indigenous woman, as an indigenous leader, and her as a woman, as a leader of, as a leader of all of women as well, and that they didn't do that.
Mm. And her daughter, I think you quote her daughter as saying that her mother was, or excuse me, the World Bank was an accomplice in Berta's death, and I was wondering if you could explain that relationship as well. I mean, it's kind of a complicated one, but it's important to this particular story and how we understand development, right?
Yeah, so development, what does it mean? You touched on this earlier, in that green energy projects. There's an assumption in the West that when you talk about green energy, solar, hydroelectric, wind, that it's just a good thing. Right? Biofuels are just a good thing. But actually, what we're seeing in Honduras and all over the world is the destruction of forest, is the forced eviction through violence of indigenous peoples and rural peoples, in order, who are generally living sustainable lives, living off the land. They are, but the destruction of this land, the culling of forests, the damming of rivers for cheap energy. You can't have clean energy. We can't have a clean energy revolution that is unjust, that is racist, and that is, imposed through violence. And that's what's happening. And that's what Bertha was opposing, right? Just this sort of imposition, again, of a model, the extractivism model, the latest tool of capitalism, of the neoliberal sort of machine, to just to gain money, to earn, to maximize profits, and to keep this model alive. And it's being imposed, and this is possible only through international capital. Now, all of those projects that I mentioned, Honduras has some rich people, but all of these big projects, whether it's industrial palm plantations, mines, dams, solar energy, they all have international investors, and many have so-called development banks. So that is taxpayer-funded banks invested in these. And the thing is, it's all so opaque, Nick. It's so hard to follow the money. Why? Why are development banks not willing to be transparent about where their money is going, where our money is going? You know, and so what we know from, and one of the things that I uncovered during this investigation was that Bertha knew, she'd heard that there was World Bank money in the dam, but the IFC, which is the World Bank sort of private lending arm, also taxpayer funding, denied it. While she was there, they denied it. After she died, they've denied it. But the evidence that I covered, that was that um, the company had obtained loans from a bank, a Honduran bank, which at the time the World Bank had a stakeholder share in. So they owned 10%. I think it was, yeah, they had a 10% stakeholder share in. So that meant during that period, I think it was like 8 years or 10 years, every loan that this bank gave was in essence a World Bank loan, which is in essence a partially taxpayer funded loan. And so that dam that Bertha was murdered opposing, and she was one of 6 people that lost their lives just defending the land and water for that one project, had taxpayers' money in it. And so how is that development and Indigenous rights? When you talk about Indigenous rights and talk about self-determination and development, it's about Indigenous people all over the world have the right, like we all have, to decide what they consider to be development or not be development, right? What they consider, what their priorities are for their own people, for their own land. And you know much more about this than me, but we can talk about a 1,000 examples here in the US, on the US borders, in Canada, and all over Latin America, of actually develop so-called development projects being imposed, and without being imposed, without consultation and without proper compensation. Bertha was not opposed to green energy or clean energy, absolutely not. But she was opposed to another sort of excuse to impose projects on Indigenous territories without consultation and without fair compensation. People have the right for self-determination, and the extractive model absolutely just violates that constantly, continuously, and in every country.
Hmm. One thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this book, and I couldn't help think of a friend of mine who I met, Francia Marquez. I don't know if you know who that is, but she's an Afro-Colombian human rights and environmental activist in Colombia, and she was also a fellow recipient of the Goldman Environmental Prize, I believe in 2018 or 2017, and 2018. And there was recently an assassination attempt on her life, and somebody that I know, after we had met her, made this comment that said, and I don't know how to take this, but they said, the Goldman Environmental Prize is basically gets you on a hit list. And I was, a little shaken up by that, but Berta Cáceres had won the Goldman Prize in 2015, and that earned her, uh, a place on a military hit list, that you uncovered, as part of, prior to writing this book, but you wrote a piece in the Guardian, and that in effect made you also, by proxy, a target, for harassment. And as a kind of final wrap up question, what's the status of, the court case has ended, and people can read the book, and you do a really good job at detailing, the evidence presented, what wasn't presented, how it was presented. But this seems to be an ongoing case, right? And it seems as if, even though Berta Cáceres had said the coup hasn't ended, it seems like as if the coup is still unfolding even to this day, in the cover up of, of the murderers. And I also can't help but think of, even in Guatemala, when they had the tribunal against those military officers who had committed acts of genocide, who were charged with committing acts of genocide, there was no accountability whatsoever. And I know that neither you or nor I are in the business of predicting the future, but where do you see this going?
I mean, there's two things I'd like to say. I mean, in terms of the case, so where we're at is that seven men who were the hitmen, so the hired shooters, and the middlemen. That's how I would describe them. Were convicted of her murder and are in prison serving 30 plus years. Um, some of them will appeal, I'm sure, but they were convicted, and having sat through every single day of that trial, they were right. I believe that they were involved, and they played a role in her murder. Um, but who ordered and paid for the murder? One person, David Castillo, who is the president of the company that I mentioned earlier, the US trained former military intelligence officer. He has been charged as as one of the intellectual authors or the masterminds of the crime, and he has been in prison awaiting trial for just over 2 years now. And that trial should, if law is followed, start within the next few months. And he denies any involvement. But I've seen all the evidence, and there are members of that company, of the executive, who should be under investigation. The evidence is there. They should be under investigation, for some for direct and some for indirect involvement. And the evidence we covered was that, okay, they were, the company, the members of the company, the board, they were using their influence to get troops, SWAT teams and police and military deployed to protest where Bertha and others were, to repress protesters. To me, that's undue influence. There were politicians named in the trial as people that the members of the company were calling to get information about what was happening with the investigation. There are many names at political and business levels, and military and police, that if I was an investigator really interested in following the evidence, I'd want to be following those leads, right? And so this battle, this struggle for justice is far from over. We know some of what happened, and there is so much that we don't know. And just a really quick example, one of the people that was convicted of her murder was a US trained special forces major at the time, and he was on track to become promoted to lieutenant colonel. He, at the time of the murder, was on his phone was tapped because he was under investigation for drug trafficking and kidnapping. So here we have, right, this guy served in Iraq with the coalition. He'd been a UN peacekeeping in the UN peacekeeping force, and he's under investigation for these very serious crimes. And yet the prosecution do not. They find a gun in his house. They do not send his gun for ballistic analysis. They do not extract any data of any phone or digital device that he has. Why would you not do that? What is it that you do? What is it that you don't want to know, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. And do I think that we will find that out in the current political climate? Absolutely not. And to finish up, what we have now is the party, the political party that that has been in power since the coup. So now it's coming up for 11 years. Is really it's a criminal state, and I can say that without any sort of fear of consequences, because the president himself has been named as a co-conspirator in a drug trafficking trial by the DEA in a New York courtroom, in which his brother, a former politician, was convicted of as for major drugs and arms trafficking. The current president has been named a co-conspirator. The previous president, who came in after those elections that I talked about in 2009, has also been named as a co-conspirator. And yet they continued to be in power. The day the president's brother, the day he was named and his brother was sentenced or convicted, the following day the president had an event, like a public event in Honduras with the US ambassador for Honduras. They were there smiling. I mean, what do these people have to do to stop being useful to the US government? And right now, it's all about forced migration. It's all the only thing this administration cares about is stopping Hondurans and Central Americans reaching their southern border. They don't care who's in power. They don't care about the misery, the poverty, the impunity, the violence that Hondurans are subjected to. They just don't want them coming anywhere near the US, and so they're happy for the current regime to continue. So in that political context, I think the chances of justice sort of moving forward are really difficult. But that doesn't, the struggle for human rights and the struggle for justice is often long in this context. And her family, her children, her friends, her colleagues are not giving this up.
Right, and that really gets. I'm glad you ended with that, especially the talking about the migration, the forced migration, because of the conditions that are the result of U.S. foreign policy. And it really gets to the heart of the global or the international division of humanity between those who live with the conditions of war and poverty, and those who live with relative peace in the global north, whose countries cause the conditions for that war and poverty in the first place. And if there's anyone's life who really represents a way to kind of scale up those local struggles into global issues, it's Berta Cáceres. And I really do think that you did justice to her story in writing this book, and understanding the actors, contact tracing imperialism, so to speak. We're in an era where we're contact tracing the virus to stop its spread, but you name names, you lay out the details of these cases, the documents, the footnotes are very rich in primary sources that you're drawing from. And I really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Nina, for coming on the show. Can you just tell people where they can find your work, and where they can get the book?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think Bertha would have been delighted that I did this interview with you. So thank you. Yeah, so I'm currently the environmental justice reporter for The Guardian in the US. So you can find me writing about all sorts of environmental inequalities affecting, being imposed on Native communities, people of color, poor Americans, on the Guardian website. And the book is available from Verso Books, but also if you, please support your local independent bookstores. I think it's bookshop.org is a website, as we're not going out right now, and they work with independent bookstores, so you can order it online from them. Don't use Amazon. That's what I'm saying.